Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. This is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Before I introduce this week's guest, I just want to let listeners know that we are recording this episode on Thursday, May 28th. Um, the legislature is hoping to adjourn tomorrow on May 29th. So who knows? All sorts of things may happen between the time we record this and the time of adjournment. So just keep that in mind, folks. Um, John Walters of the Vermont Political Observer, thank you for being with us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Now, did you have a good rest in San Francisco a couple weeks ago? Or 1 week ago now, I guess.
We were there for about 8 days. My partner had a conference to go to, and I tagged along and walked around the city a lot. Uh, I stood on the corner of Haight and Ashbury streets. Haight Street is sort of a delightful theme park uh, with
A hippie
lots
theme park?
lots of vintage clothing, stores and bars and restaurants, all with sort of a counterculture theme. Obviously San Francisco's general real estate boom has, helped housing prices quite a bit. So there's no like flop houses anywhere along Haight Street anymore. So it's a very fun place to be. Ditto Castro, the LGBTQ neighborhood, is also kind of a theme park. Only well-to-do LGBTQ people can live there, but it's fun to be there, and lots of nice places to see in San Francisco. And so we enjoyed ourselves, and now I'm back and trying to readjust to Eastern time.
Um, are you one of those folks who you love leaving Vermont and having some time away, but you're so happy when you come home?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I go to a city, I like to go to art museums and see concerts of the kind that, Vermont just doesn't have the population to support. So, I spent a day in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I saw a dance performance that I just happened to see a flyer for on the street. And we went to the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. That's the kind of big city thing. And the fact that there were like three really good diners within a block of our hotel, that you don't get that in Vermont. But you also don't have the crowds and the traffic and the hustle and bustle and all that, which is fun at first and wears on you after a while. So yeah, I'm happy to be back in little old Vermont.
Well, we're glad you're back. But yes, it is. I think it's good to get out of our regular comfort zones from time to time and just, yeah, see and do different things to remind us that there's life beyond our regular scope of vision,
Yes.
you know. And speaking of life beyond scopes of vision, um, for better or for worse, that may have come out more cheeky than I meant. Uh, the legislature is busy trying to crank out some, what I would consider some major pieces of legislation before adjournment, which, as I said earlier, they're hoping will be tomorrow, but it may not. Some of the big bills still hanging out, of course, is H.955, the education reform bill. But then we also have our big kind of budget bills are still hanging out there as well. Um, you and I were going through the state website to look at all the number of conference committees that have been set up as well, meaning, the House and the Senate trying to reconcile differences in their bills. Um, I don't know, John, what do you think? Do they stand a chance of getting a lot of this done in the next, what, 24, 48 hours?
If they are really determined to get out of town this week, they will find a way to get out of town this week. Um,
Ain't that human nature?
Well, we saw that with the education bill, where last Friday, the House and Senate leadership had been meeting with the governor's people to try to come up with a compromise that would satisfy all parties,
Hmm.
and they issued a plan last Friday afternoon. In the business, we call that a news dump, where bad news or possibly disturbing news is released at the time when there is the least media attention.
Yeah,
But
like 5:01 on a Friday.
they released the bill Friday, and as soon as Memorial Day was done, the Senate took it up, passed it on Tuesday, sent it to the House. The House did not immediately concur, so they have a conference committee that is actually meeting while we are taping this. So we shall see what comes of that. And as you said, there are a number of other, budget bill, property tax, yield bill, tax bill, transportation, the capital bill for capital expenditures. Those are all still out there. Probably there is certainly a lot of incentive to move toward adjournment. They've already been in session for almost a month of overtime compared to their normal session time. So there's a lot of incentive to get out of town um, and get back to either their day jobs or their family lives and or start campaigning for reelection. They're already getting a little bit of a late start for that. So um, I don't know whether they will adjourn on Friday or maybe leak over into Saturday or have to come back next week to wrap up loose ends. But they're steaming toward adjournment, and I think there's a sort of a broad general idea of what's going to pass. I think the education bill that was reached, a week ago is going to pass more or less as it stands now.
Hmm.
It's kind of they're way too far down the road to start taking that thing apart and trying to rebuild it. So I think we can, I think the momentum is all toward adjournment very quickly, very soon. The
Now,
only fly in the ointment on that is whether the governor decides to veto any of the big must-pass bills.
that's
Uh,
true. Yep.
he would have to call the legislature back into session.
Hmm.
So that, or if they have, or if he vetoes any bills and the legislature wants to try to override, they would have to come back in an override session. So we are probably not done with everything, but we can suddenly see the finish line in sight, where for a long time we had no idea how long they were going to stay in session.
Right. Now, I just remind me, John, one of the hiccups to H.955, the ed reform bill, has been whether or not to include voluntary or mandatory school mergers. And I believe the last time I looked, H.955 is now focused on voluntary mergers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the big sticking point, well, there are, I guess, more than one sticking points, but the big sticking point between the governor and the legislature was he wanted a mandatory process for consolidation and school closure. The legislature leaned toward some sort of voluntary process with incentives.
Mm-hmm.
That was the conclusion, by the way, of the quote unquote failed school district redistricting task force last year.
Yes.
Uh, and the governor gave significant ground on that, and I have to think that he realized that mandatory consolidation was going to be hugely unpopular. Um, and that's why the legislature balked at it. And so they are focused on a voluntary process with a quicker timeline than was in the original House version of
Mm.
education. I think last summer we had a lot of public consternation over H.73, the education reform bill, which was, negotiated very quickly at the end of the session and then launched into the public view. And I think we're going to see the same thing this summer when people realize that the legislature and the governor have put together something at the last minute with no public review at all. They did this behind closed doors, and it's going to have significant consequences one way or another for their schools.
Hmm.
They're going to be asked to get going pretty quickly on a reorganization process and reviewing whether to consolidate and close schools. So I think this is going to come as another shock to the electorate. Um, and we shall see whether, whether they rebel enough to make anyone change their minds. But that's where we're going, and I think there's going to be another summer of confusion and anger over what's going on with the schools. And
Mm.
a lot of that is because fundamentally everybody realizes we need to make changes, and nobody likes what the changes might mean to their particular neighborhood or their community or their school. So it's a really tough thing to tackle. Uh,
Hmm.
and the legislature is tackling it in a way that's likely to produce the maximum public reaction,
Yeah,
which is probably not what they had in mind. But I should say the legislature and the governor. He's always been happy to do these kinds of things at the last minute and behind closed doors. So he should bear at least half of the onus for whatever comes of this process.
I think that's fair. So, John, talking about education reform, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have been looking at education for a while, looking at particularly the costs of education and how that impacts property taxes, municipal budgets, the whole nine yards. Um, which is a, very understandable conversation to have. But I am still wondering, you mentioned confusion and consternation that may be happening this summer with community members. And I wonder if part of that confusion too is we don't really, well, we've been talking about what's not working, and we're talking about definitely we want things to cost less. But does the state have a unified vision of what we want schools to be? Like, do we know what we're working towards, or is it all reaction? And I may have it may be out there, and I may have just straight up missed it. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, a lot of it is reaction.
Hmm.
The urgency of this task is because property taxes have risen by so much in recent years.
Yeah.
A lot of that has nothing to do with the cost of public education. A lot of it has to do, well, the biggest cost driver is the cost of healthcare for public school employees.
Mm,
They're doing very little to address the crisis and the cost of healthcare. And if that continues to go up by anywhere from single digits to double digits per year, then the schools are going to be just in a tighter and tighter vice. And there isn't the attention on healthcare that there is on the cost of of public education right now, and there needs to be. Um,
so are we solving the wrong problem?
Otherwise, I mean, going back almost 30 years to the Brigham decision, ever since then, governors and legislatures have been trying to concoct a better, fairer, more equitable, and reasonably priced public education system.
Hmm.
And they haven't gotten it right yet, so why start now?
Yeah, there are a lot of strong feelings out there around Act 60, both
Yeah.
pro and con. Um, and but you're right, it does feel like we have yet to get it to strike the right balance
Yeah.
between equity and cost and everything.
And whatever comes out of this year's process is almost certainly going to have unintended consequences that will need to be addressed next year or the year after that or the year after that. Um, so, you know, um, this is not over, no matter what happens. this week or next week.
Right, whether the bill passes or not, it is not over. Um, Another bill that you were looking at and that has gone to conference committee, I believe, is S-208, which is about law enforcement in Vermont needing to um, be very clear that they are law enforcement, no masks.
No
Uh,
mask, some sort of visible identification beyond just like ICE or
yeah.
whatever, like badges or, names or something like that. The Senate passed a bill that included local, state, and federal law enforcement. By the time the House received the bill, there had been a court decision in California that threw out a similar California law. So the House looked at that and said, if we include federal agents, we're not likely to win a court challenge. And therefore, why subject ourselves to the trouble and expense of fighting that battle? So the House version of the bill uh, requires local and state law enforcement to not be masked while conducting their duties and must wear identification, but it does not include federal agents.
Mm,
Um, so, the philosophical question there is, do you want to do what's pragmatic, or if you feel like we're in a situation that's urgent enough and desperate enough, do you want to make a statement and pass a law that probably won't survive a court challenge, but is there value in making that statement and defending that statement in court?
hmm
I would opt for the latter, but I can understand why some people opted for the former. And now, the Senate and House conferees will have to, meet and decide which version of the bill they want to put forward, if any. Um, I suspect that probably, in the rush toward adjournment, that probably the House version will hold sway, and they will pass a bill aimed specifically at local and state law enforcement. And I will say that in the notorious South Burlington Dorset Street confrontation with ICE and protesters and state and local police, that some of the state and local police were masked.
mm-hmm.
They said it was to guard against, being spit on or having somebody try to use pepper spray or bear spray or something against police. And the come back to that, well, you could use a transparent shield, a face shield, as opposed to a balaclava or something.
Right.
Uh, Face shield would actually be more effective against like tear gas or something. But
Good point.
I would think. But anyway, that's kind of getting into the weeds. We'll probably have a bill that will force local and state police to, be visible and be identifiable when carrying out their duties, and I think that's a good thing, honestly.
Well, definitely, because in my mind, what it does is it raises the I don't know if question's the right word, but I think there is an expectation in our democracy that people take accountability for their words, their actions, their deeds. We don't see members of the legislature now that COVID has passed walking around wearing masks. Like we know what the governor looks like. He doesn't attend press conferences masked. Reporters are expected to be clearly identified and, not walking around with a mask on. Um,
It
it
would be fun
seems
if
lo
they used it would be fun if they used like, voice concealing devices, like, they all were talking like Stephen Hawking or something like that. But uh, it's for the best, and I think it's appropriate for police to be identifiable when they are carrying out duties that might involve some pretty serious, actions.
Mhm. And we have just over 5 minutes before we head into the next section, or we hear from some underwriters. I think we should talk about Prop 4 in the next half. What do we need to leave listeners with right now?
Um, well, uh, it's been a long session. There's been a lot of confrontation between the legislature and the governor. Uh, it seems to be dissipating very rapidly, which makes you wonder how real it ever was. Um, but, with the pressure of wanting to adjourn and get out of here, you know, uh, all the details and all the points of contention seem less important than they did a few weeks ago. So um, I think if there's, well, I wrote one of my pieces about this. I said, and I've said it before, the legislature is very fond of its very deliberative process where they take testimony and they move bills through different committees and then they go to the floor and then they go to the other side, the other chamber, and they go through that chamber's committee process. And, it takes months for a bill to work its way through that process. And they are very proud of that. And, they're rightfully so. I mean, laws are complicated. Writing laws is a fraught process, and you do need to consider all aspects of an issue.
Mhm.
Um, so they're very proud of that, and they say that that's how we write good laws. And then they get to the end of a session, and they like get together sometimes in secret and like hammer out a completely different bill than the one they've been working on so diligently for months. And it does kind of make you wonder whether all that stuff is necessary, and if it is, then why do they dispense with it when they want to get out of town?
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that I have this lingering thought on the back of my mind that I have not um, tried to formulate yet. Um, Writing legislation is a complicated process.
Yes.
It is difficult to get it right when you're dealing with major systemic change like the education system. Um, in some ways, our process is ill-suited to the demands of writing legislation in the 21st century. Um, they're dealing with things like AI and digital privacy and all sorts of stuff that's beyond the ken of your average lawmaker. Um, and they are a part-time legislature that meets 4 days a week for a few months, and then they're gone for the rest of the year. And they have no staff. They have very little staff. Um, it's not like Congress or like the state legislature in New York, for instance, for better or worse. So, are they really equipped to handle the demands of writing laws in a very complicated society? I would think the answer to that in many ways is no. I don't know what the
Hmm.
solution to that is. There has been talk occasionally about reducing the number of people in the legislature and making it a full-time job or making it something closer to a full-time job and giving them
Right.
more time and more resources. That's probably a political non-starter because nobody wants to be in a bigger House district and lose their representative and make significant change. But we would probably be better off if we had like 100 people in the House and 20 people in the Senate, and they had more resources and they had a bigger salary. But I doubt that that's ever going to happen. We're going to kind of keep bumbling along and pass big bills that then have to be fixed, you
Yeah.
know, further
You
down
know,
the road.
it's funny you say this, John, because I've been wondering the same thing for a while. Is our system set up, especially, so much of Vermont's like local fabric is built around volunteerism, and even that's tough now with people working multiple jobs or working jobs outside of their town. Volunteerism is getting harder. And so I've been wondering that for a while, like, are our municipalities set up to tackle many of the issues that they need to tackle? But I was speaking with a planner this weekend down in Brattleboro, and he said something very similar. And I don't remember if he thought the legislature should be full time, but one thing he said he really, really wished the legislature had was staff. who could research topics and get information. He was particularly concerned about special interest groups and their impact on our state legislature. Because there's no staff to do other research, you end up relying on special interest groups. Um, but your question, you're not alone. I think more people are starting to ask that is, can our system actually do what we need it to do,
Yeah.
given the givens?
I mean, we're going into a period where we are trying to, or we are about to try to address a bunch of significant crises, from healthcare to public education to higher education, vocational education, housing, homelessness, substance abuse. Um, and I'm forgetting a few, but it's a big list of well, climate change, renewable energy. Um, it's a big list that's going to take some serious consideration, and yeah, um, it would be better right now. The legislature, each of the leaders has a staff person. Each committee has a staff person who basically handles the schedule.
Mhm.
The legislature has two collective bodies, the Joint Fiscal Office, which handles financial and budget matters,
Right.
and Legislative Council, which is a team of lawyers that basically writes bills and rewrites bills when the legislature amends the bills. Um, but there isn't, aside from the JFO, there isn't any staff that's designed to really dig into serious issues.
Mm.
I think that's probably why we have so many task forces and special commissions. Um,
Yeah, you got
and
to gather the information somehow.
it would be better if we had some more policy analysis muscle in the legislature. That would be very helpful. But again, that would require us to either find the resources to fund that or save money in how we run the legislature elsewhere.
Hmm.
Um, Probably not going to happen.
At least not this week. Hey, listeners, hang tight. John and I will be right back after we hear from some underwriters here on WVEW. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with John Walters, the journalist behind the Vermont Political Observer. So glad you're joining us, John.
Thank you again for having me.
Well, and before we dive back into our conversation, would you remind listeners?
The fundamentals, the views and descriptions of this telecast. No, the views expressed on this podcast slash community access program slash wherever you consume this content are those of the host and the guest, and of no one else at any of the presenting agencies or organizations. So don't blame them, blame us.
Well done, John. And I want to quickly thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with media centers around the state. Um, I was laughing, John, while you were talking because it's and now I just lost my thought. It was so funny and clever, and now it just went poof out of my head. Well, if the lazy Susan that is Olga's brain spins back around, um, I'll share the the brilliant thought. Um, in the meantime, let's switch our conversation to Prop 4, which is a amendment to our Constitution to add an equal protection clause. Um, that I
Most
think,
institutions have, and ours has never had.
oh, that's a good point. Thank you for reminding us of that. And the House recently passed the the proposition 128 to 14 and the Senate 29 to 0. But in your piece on Prop 4, You brought up a really interesting theme that I think will play out when we get to talking about upcoming elections or the upcoming primary, because this proposition has needed to go through two bienniums
Mhm.
before it will go to a statewide vote in November. So it has not gone through a quick, but shooting from the hip process. It has been a very deliberative process, considered by, two different legislatures essentially. And yet, when you went through the voting on this proposition, you actually saw that some people had changed their votes from yes to no.
Yeah.
And I think for you, the concern is, are we seeing some of our legislatures go further to the right?
Yeah.
And that brings about concerns for you around people's protections and people's rights and the policy around protecting people, basically.
Well, the argument for PR4 is basically we don't have an equal protection clause. It would be good to have one because it is a sounder basis for court decisions about rights than what they've been depending on for court decisions. And it would be good to have this enshrined in our Constitution in case the political culture changes enough that there might be a threat to people's rights, as there is currently from the federal government. Whether you are a person of color or an LGBTQ person who might be facing some level of scrutiny or even oppression or prosecution. So we shouldn't depend on it can't happen here, and that's the argument for it. And when you have, I think what has happened with some of these people who have switched from yes to no, and they are all Republicans who did this. Um, I think a couple of things are happening. One is, there's more conservative media. There's a bigger conservative media bubble. So maybe they are taking in this, the largely spurious arguments against PR4. The other thing is that the 2024 election, a number of very extreme conservatives were elected to the legislature. So there is now kind of a small but bigger critical mass so that someone with extreme views doesn't feel so isolated and might feel a little more enabled or emboldened to take action. And people who represent conservative districts might feel a little more pressure to conform to what they see as the wishes of their electorate. So, someone like I will mention a couple of people who have been in the legislature. Well, one person who's been in the legislature a long time, and he is a very respected Republican, Tom Burdett of Rutland, who is like holds a senior position on one of the most important committees, and I think it's Ways and Means. But he's a very well respected person as someone who is willing to work with the majority, even if he disagrees with the majority, and be a productive part of the lawmaking process. And he voted yes for PR4 in 2024, and he voted no this time. And I haven't talked to him and find out why he did that. Um, but he wasn't the only one who switched sides. Um, and to me, it's a small thing. It's still, it passed overwhelmingly. But it is a thing that is worth noting. And it is a consequence of Governor Phil Scott supporting a number of people he probably wouldn't have supported in the past because they were, far to the right of himself and where he wants the state to go. But I think because he really needed to break the Democrat supermajority, he campaigned actively for and fundraised for a number of extremely conservative people who are now in the legislature. And there are consequences to that. It is a friendlier place than it used to be for people with extreme views who might have felt very much alone in the past and now feel like there are at least some other people who feel as they do.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's a small thing. It's nowhere near a majority, but it is a trend worth keeping an eye on. And one of the things that I plan to do once the legislature is adjourned is to try to look at the public records of some of these very conservative people and show where their personal views they might have concealed some of their personal views in order to gain office, in order to run as Phil Scott Republicans, when in fact they are not Phil Scott Republicans. And I think there's a need to show who some of these people are and what they believe. And then if the voters want to reelect them, fine. Free speech, room for everybody. But the voters should know who these people are and what they stand for. And right now, in many cases, they do not.
Um, so just a note, I don't remember which committee you said Tom serves on, but I just checked. It's the House Committee on Judiciary.
Okay, that's right. He's the leading Republican on House Judiciary.
Yeah.
Very
Also,
in the S208 discussion that we talked about earlier, the whether police should be masked or not.
mhm.
Um, he had a big voice in whether that went forward.
So this is a question, John. I don't know how if you know the answer to, but I guess it's my devil's advocate question. Do you feel that this shift you're seeing in the Republican Party to further to the right is a result of more conservative lawmakers gaining seats? Or do you think it's a representation of more of the Vermont community shifting to the right? Like, which is the dog wagging his tail or is the tail wagging the dog? I guess is kind of my question on that.
Yeah, I mean, 2024 was one data point. A lot of Republicans won. Um, the question is that an outlier because of an outburst of anger over taxation, over property taxes? Or is that a trend that we are at the beginning of? There was a lot of evidence in the 2024 election nationally that red parts of the country got redder. And we're kind of seeing that in some of the primaries in other states this year with, very conservative people winning primaries, often over current office holders. So, are rural parts of Vermont following that trend? Are they becoming more conservative, more Trumpy? I mean, many of the town and county Republican committees are far more conservative than they used to be and far more conservative than Phil Scott is.
Hmm.
Most of the energy and enthusiasm on the right is on the far right. And those
Hmm.
are the people who show up to meetings and run for party offices and get elected to party offices. And moderate Republicans often feel left out and
Hmm.
excluded from the process, or they just don't want to be part of a process that's going in that direction. So you have, extremely conservative Republicans running county committees in blue areas like Addison County and Washington County and Chittenden County and Windham County, for instance. And when they get together, they nominate like-minded candidates. And, you know, are a lot of them lose because they are so out of step with the electorate in their districts. But some of them win. And so, some of them did win in 2024. And are we going to see more of that? Are we going to see a bigger divide between, liberal Vermont and conservative Vermont, which is often broken down by urban versus rural, but it's not necessarily exactly that way. And, to be honest, in the larger scheme of things, there is nothing in Vermont that qualifies as urban. But anyway, Burlington would be a town in any other state or in almost any other state.
Hmm.
So, are we going to see? I suspect that we're going to see the Democrats win back some ground in November in the legislature.
Hmm.
But are we going to see the confirmation that some districts, especially in rural areas, have permanently moved further to the right? Are the Democrats going to be able to compete in a place like, Grand Isle or anywhere in the Northeast Kingdom or Rutland County? And I don't know the answer to that. That's, the result of this election will be one more big data point in answering that question.
I think and I'm just sorry folks, I'm kind of looking something up while I'm doing this. Um I think it's becoming more and more important as voters to really I okay, backing up. We have a tradition in Vermont of voting for people. And it's why quite often when you hear about political statistics around Vermont, is Vermonters are known for in political circles for like voting all over the ballot. They might vote for an independent here or a Republican there, a Dem there, so they're kind of all over the ballot. Um,
We, we
and
are very we are very proud of the fact that there is no straight ticket voting in Vermont,
there,
and there is
yes.
no registration by party. I grew up in a state where there is straight ticket voting,
Hmm.
and I find it to be inoffensive and actually helpful because, chances are I'm going to be voting mostly, if not all, Democrats anyway. But we are very proud of that fact and the fact that we are, at least in terms of our public labeling, we are all independent.
Um, and I think there's something really wonderful about that, but I do feel that since our parties are being shook up, in recent years with you're seeing more Republicans going far right. You and I have talked about how some Republicans who no longer felt at home in the Republican Party have, say, moved to the Dems or even an independent, which of course then changes the flavor of the Democratic Party. Um, and because of that, I just think as voters, it's become much more important that we really look at policy and previous voting patterns and that type of things because right now so much of the noise is, well, vote for me because I'm not like so and so, whoever evil so and so happens to be wherever you're sitting on the political spectrum. But that's not really that doesn't really tell you how someone's going to vote or make a decision or how they can handle policy, that type of thing. And so I think it's going to mean more work for us as voters going forward.
Especially since, our news media has shrunk so severely that most news organizations do not have the capacity to dive deeply into candidates' records. Um, the standard fare for covering an election, quote unquote, is to run candidate profiles side by side.
Hmm.
And they're based not on any reporting, but on questionnaires submitted by the candidates. So, there is little to no active effort to really figure out who these people are. And when you have a lot of extreme conservative people presenting themselves as Phil Scott Republicans,
Right.
then that's a problem. And our media are not doing the job in trying to, look into. And there are ways that are not that hard to look into a candidate's background or where they stand on the record. I will name one tool that I'm planning to make use of this summer to look at Republican office holders who show signs of being extreme conservatives. It's a handy AI-based tool, and AI does have positive uses. Yes, it does.
It's
It's
used as a tool rather than a solution.
right. Golden Dome VT, goldendomevt.com. It is an AI tool that offers AI generated transcriptions of every legislative hearing, House and Senate, every committee. It doesn't do floor debates, and I kind of wish it did, but it does do all the committees. And it's searchable, and it links directly to the YouTube video of the committee hearing. So you can so it does a rough transcript of the entire hearing. And if you highlight part, like you can search for an issue or a topic or a specific speaker. If I want to look at what, State Rep Rob North has said on the record in his committee, then I can just search for him in each committee hearing. And it'll take me directly to anything that he says, and I can look at what he said and see if there's anything in there that I feel is worth reporting on. If you highlight that section of the transcript, the video box takes you directly to that moment in the video, so that you can click on it and you can review what the transcript says and make sure it's accurate. So, and that does take some time and effort, but it makes it at least feasible to take a look at what these people have said on the record in the legislature. Whereas it used to be you would have to monitor every committee hearing and wait for somebody to speak up.
Right.
Golden Dome VT, if you're interested in what your representative or senator has been up to in the legislature, that is a tool that at least makes it possible. And I'm hoping to spend a lot of time on Golden Dome this summer.
And listeners, I will link to that in the show notes for this episode as well, so you can find it. Um, well, and one reason all of this, we're even talking about this right now, John, is tomorrow is the deadline for candidates to file for the general election or the primary, correct?
As we are taping on Thursday, May 28th, and it's actually at 5 p.m. today.
Oh, 5 p.m. today. Okay.
That's for major party candidates because the work has to be done to, put together ballots so they can be mailed to people who want to vote before primary day, which is in August.
And those
Independent,
ballots go out in June.
yeah, independent candidates have a lot longer to file, but major party candidates have to be in today, May 28th. In fact, in my email inbox this morning, I got an email from State Treasurer Mike Pichak announcing that he was running for re-election because today's the filing deadline, and people probably would have noticed if he filed for treasurer, there's been perpetual speculation that he will run for governor, and now he has made it official that he is not,
Mhm.
um, which is probably a big fat hint that Phil Scott is running for re-election. As far as I know, he hasn't filed yet. By the time anybody sees this, he will have either filed or not.
Correct.
If he has not quite made up his mind yet, he will file, and then he can always withdraw. So
Hmm.
anyway, the point being, yeah, it's getting late early, and it is whether the legislature has adjourned or not. By the time people see or hear this, the campaign season has officially begun.
And two folks you're following are the two candidates who have thrown their hat in the ring for gubernatorial um, as
Yep.
candidates from the Democratic Party, and that's Amanda Janeau and Allie Richards. Anything about either of these candidates that stand out to you so far?
Well, I have been listening to, they did kind of back-to-back episodes of Mark Johnson, the longtime journalist and radio person. He does a podcast called 802 News, not to plug one of your competitors,
Uh,
but
nope, he's great. Actually, I'm going to link to it in the show notes, folks. So,
he interviewed Allie Richards and then Amanda Janeau on back-to-back episodes. So it was the first chance to compare and contrast the two candidates in the identical setting. We haven't seen any candidate forums, at least not any that were widely broadcast yet. So this was a valuable exercise in figuring out who these people are, because both of them, I don't think either of them has ever run for any office before.
I don't
Um,
believe so, no.
Allie Richards has been involved in government and in the lobbying effort for childcare, Let's Grow Kids. She was
Mhm.
ahead of that. But she has never been a candidate for office herself. And Amanda Janeau is an economist and has done a lot of consulting for governments in the U.S. and around the world. So she has deep experience in developing policy and implementing it, but she has never been a candidate for office herself. So these are both first-time candidates with very low public profiles as far as the Vermont electorate is concerned. Um, and they present themselves pretty differently. I mean, Allie Richards is really presenting herself as a centrist, pragmatic politician. She spoke very highly of Dean Davis, for instance, who was a moderate Republican back when those beasts still walked the earth. Um, and she was extremely timid in any sort of criticism of Phil Scott.
Hmm.
She said it's time for a change, it's time for a different person in the office. But part of that is based solely on the fact that Phil Scott is in his fifth term,
Hmm.
and that's normally the limit for Vermont governors. Um, she hasn't really said much about his policies and where he has gone wrong. She just said it's time for a different look at things. Um, Amanda Janeau, on the other hand, paints herself as, I mean, she doesn't paint herself as a Bernie Sanders figure, but she's
Mm.
definitely in the Bernie uh, spectrum. She evaluates, she wants, economies to work for the benefit of all the people rather than for maximizing profit.
Right.
Uh, she wants a healthcare system that provides healthcare for all in some way or other. She's not proposing single payer healthcare for Vermont, but she would like to see universal primary care where people have open access to at least, nurse practitioners and nurses and primary care physicians as a middling step, a partial solution to our healthcare crisis. And she's willing to raise taxes to do it. She is a proponent of the fair share plan to raise taxes on people who earn more than $500,000 a year, which seems quite reasonable to me, especially since those people have gotten huge tax breaks from the federal government in the two Trump administrations. But that's where she would raise the money to pay for universal primary care, for instance, and to fund some other priorities where she would like to take more robust government action. Um, neither of them has run for office before. You can kind of tell that when you listen to
Hmm.
their interviews. Allie Richards is a little too energetic and a little too pushy, forceful, whatever. And I don't mean that in a sexist kind of way. I would feel the same way if a male candidate talked as fast as she does. Amanda Janeau is clearly, she has a lot of experience articulating policy in a consultancy role, but not as a candidate. And she was pretty clearly trying to marshal her thoughts and present herself as an appealing way as possible,
Mm.
which
Yeah.
meant there were some long pauses. um, and it's a horrendously steep learning curve for both of them because, they've got, until mid-August to convince Democratic voters to make them the candidate. And they've got only a couple of months after that until the November election, and they've got to convince people to get rid of Phil Scott and install, vote for them instead.
Hmm.
So it's a really tough climb. I find both of them interesting candidates. And it just depends on what you want in the next governor of Vermont. Do you want a pragmatist who's going to try to make things better without, fundamental change in taxation or revenue or spending, or and just try to make things run better? And Allie Richards has experience at taking an issue, tackling it, making the case, building consensus, and implementing policy? Or do you want someone with, frankly, a more progressive outlook who wants to make some significant change in order to meet our various challenges and crises? And, I think both, to me, are intriguing candidates. They could have some appeal. Either one could have some appeal to the electorate. If you're thinking tactically, do you want someone who's not too far from Phil Scott in terms of profile and appeal,
Hmm.
who isn't too scary, quote unquote? In which case you might favor Allie Richards. You might say, well, someone who just says it's time for a change might be less scary to voters than someone who's calling for a fundamental rethink.
Hmm.
But if you think it's time for a fundamental rethink because of all the crises we face, then you'd probably want to take a closer look at Amanda Janeau. I
Hmm.
would urge voters to take a closer look at both of them and
Yes.
make an informed decision on which one, because I think both are interesting, appealing candidates in their own ways, and both are unconventional candidates. So, we'll see. Clock's ticking. They don't have much time. And, we'll see what they do with the 2.5 months, more or less, that they have to run for the primary.
And on that, our clock has ticked down too, John. And perfect timing. Thank you for that rundown, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. If people want to find your work, how can they do that?
My blog is called the Vermont Political Observer, and yes, it's still legal to run a blog in 2026, even though everybody's migrated to Substack or Beehive or whatever. I'm still doing a blog, and it's the Vermont Political Observer, the VPO.org, and very easily findable if you search for the Vermont Political Observer or even just the VPO. Not hard to find.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2 and rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings and wherever you subscribe to your podcasts and also on BCTV. So, hey, everyone, have a good weekend. Stay safe, have fun, and we will see you next week.